Before starting the story, let us know where you're watching from and what time you're watching. The figure on the horizon. Chapter 1. The Unsettling Sight. The small seaside town of Marrow's Edge was a place forgotten by time. Its windswept cliffs, grey skies, and crumbling buildings gave it an air of melancholy, a quiet beauty that kept its few residents tethered to its shores. Among them was Evelyn Moore, a reclusive artist who had come to the town a year ago, seeking solace after the loss of her husband. Evelyn spent her days painting the ocean, capturing its many moods from the window of her cottage, perched precariously on the edge of the cliffs. Her solace was found in the rhythm of the waves, the cries of the gulls, and the endless expanse of the horizon. But one cold autumn evening, as she worked on a particularly turbulent seascape, something caught her eye. Out on the horizon, against the fiery orange of the setting sun, stood a figure. It was distant, almost indistinguishable, but unmistakably human. Evelyn squinted, her brush hovering above the canvas. Who would be out there, she murmured to herself. The sea was vast, and no boat was visible. The figure seemed to stand on the water itself, motionless against the waves. As the sun dipped lower, the figure vanished into the encroaching darkness. Chapter 2. The Warnings. The next morning, Evelyn walked into town, her thoughts preoccupied with what she had seen. The locals, though polite, were distant, preferring to keep to themselves. Evelyn had grown accustomed to their quiet nods and brief conversations, but today she felt compelled to ask questions. At the general store, she approached Mrs. Hensley, the elderly woman who ran the place. "Mrs. Hensley, have you ever seen someone out on the horizon?" she asked hesitantly. The woman's weathered face darkened. She glanced around, as if fearing someone might overhear. "You've seen it, haven't you? The figure?" Evelyn's heart quickened. "Yes, do you know what it is?" Mrs. Hensley leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a bad omen, dear. Everyone who's seen it, something terrible happens to them. It's best to forget you saw anything." Evelyn's stomach churned. What kind of terrible things? The old woman shook her head. "Best not to talk about it. Go home, and whatever you do, don't look for it again." Evelyn left the store with more questions than answers. As she walked back to her cottage, the wind howled through the narrow streets, carrying with it a sense of unease. Chapter 3. The Return. Despite Mrs. Hensley's warning, Evelyn couldn't shake the image of the figure from her mind. That evening, she set up her easel by the window, determined to paint something else, anything else to distract herself. But as the sun began to set, her eyes drifted to the horizon. There it was again, the figure. This time it was closer. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She grabbed her binoculars and focused on the figure. It was still indistinct, shrouded in mist, but she could make out more detail: a long coat, hair that seemed to flow unnaturally in the wind, and Wodo's empty eye socket. The figure's head tilted as if it knew she was watching. Evelyn dropped the binoculars and stumbled back, her pulse racing. The figure didn't move but remained fixed on the horizon, its presence oppressive and wrong. Chapter 4. The Shadows Grow. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and dread. Evelyn barely slept, her dreams haunted by the figure. It appeared every evening at sunset, inching closer each time. She began noticing other things too. Shadows that didn't belong, whispers in the wind that seemed to call her name, and an overwhelming sense of being watched, even in the safety of her home. Desperate for answers, she visited the town library, poring over dusty tomes and local legends. She found scanned references to the Watcher of the Horizon, a figure said to appear to those marked by tragedy. The stories were vague, but all had one thing in common: the figure's approach signaled the beginning of a descent into madness. Chapter 5. The Confrontation. By the end of the week, Evelyn could no longer ignore the figure. It was now so close that she could see the pale, skeletal outline of its face and the ragged edges of its cloak. That night, Unable to bear the tension, she grabbed a flashlight and ventured out onto the cliffs. The wind howled around her, biting at her skin as she approached the edge. "What do you want?" she screamed into the void. "Why are you here?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised an arm and pointed at her. A deafening roar filled her ears as the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. She stumbled back, barely catching herself before she fell. When she looked up again, the figure was gone. Chapter 6. The Truth Revealed. Evelyn returned to her cottage, shaken but determined. That night she dreamt of her husband James. He stood on the horizon, calling her name, his voice filled with longing. When she woke, she felt an unbearable weight of grief. The figure wasn't just an omen, it was a harbinger of unresolved pain. It had come for her because she hadn't let go of James. With trembling hands, she pulled out an old box filled with his belongings. She spent the day going through each item, reliving their memories. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered her goodbyes. Chapter 7. The Final Sunset. That evening, Evelyn sat by the window waiting for the figure. When it appeared, she didn't feel fear but a strange sense of peace. It stood on the horizon, its head tilted as if acknowledging her. Evelyn opened the window. "I'm ready," she said softly. The figure raised its arm one final time. A gust of wind swept through the room, carrying with it the faint scent of the sea. When Evelyn blinked, the figure was gone. She felt lighter, the oppressive weight that had hung over her finally lifted. For the first time in a year, she slept soundly, dreaming of James not in sorrow but in joy. Epilogue. The horizon clears. Evelyn continued to live in Marrow's Edge, her art taking on new life and vibrancy. The figure never returned, and the horizon, once a source of fear, became a place of inspiration. The townsfolk noticed the change in her, though no one dared ask about it. Evelyn carried the truth quietly, knowing that she had faced the darkness and found her way back to the light. And every evening, as the sun set over the water, she would look out at the horizon and smile, knowing she was finally free.